I think we'll start now. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and welcome to Practical Strategies for Conservationists in an Increasingly Digital World. This session is focusing on practical experience and ways to harness Web3 AI technologies for positive conservation impact. We're going to address how to progress the digital journey of organizations, how to create an enabling environment that supports digital adoption and innovation, and how to be mindful of systemic impact of new technologies and ways of working. We're going to encourage conversation and provide that opportunity to engage with speakers and with each other, including through the chat and through Q&A at the end. So I think we can start now. My name is Catherine Foster. I'm facilitating the session today. I'm a former and long recovered Canadian diplomat who specialized in climate and human security in the late 90s and early noughts. And I've been spearheading impact innovation for over 30 years in leadership roles that range from the EU climate kick to microfinance to startups, and now as the executive director of the Green Digital Finance Alliance. I've also served as an advisor to the World Bank on blockchain for carbon markets, to the Bank of International Settlement on Project Genesis, and as a Sherpa to the United Nations Secretary General Task Force on digital financing of the SDGs. And more importantly, I lead collaborations for practical implementation as well as thought leadership, including on digital and emerging techs, on the opportunities, challenges, and unforeseen impacts. And one thing I emphasize is what I call the 4Gs of the digital divide: gender, geography, generational, and groups of stakeholders. And so I'll be drawing a bit on that through this conversation. But this is about the experts that we've brought together. We're going to have a number of presentations and actually a discussion throughout this session of 90 minutes. I want to turn now to our first speaker, to Sasha Sebright. And excuse me, I'm feeling a little off and my voice is cracking a little bit. And I need to actually now bring up Sasha Sebright, who's the project manager of the Digital Disruption and the Future of Conservation Initiative. So while she's working on the ground at the intersection of animal welfare and wildlife rehabilitation, she realized the complexities of conservation issues and began to explore ways to influence efforts at a systemic level. This led her to Unearthodox and her current work exploring the systemic impacts of Web3 and AI on and for conservation. Sasha, please take the mic.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you for being here despite feeling very unwell. Sadly, Catherine isn't the only person that's unwell today. Unfortunately, our CEO, Melanie Ryan, can't be here today to open the session. So before giving my short presentation, I'm going to step in on Mel's behalf and just give a bit of a background regarding what brings us here today. So we began the Digital Disruption and Future of Conservation project at the end of 2021, after the Gamifying Nature Conservation Initiative revealed a hugely growing interest among conservationists to know more about key emerging technologies and concepts like blockchain and Web3. And there was a strong interest, but lack of clarity on where to go for information and support on these concepts. So our guiding questions throughout the project have been: how can conservation NGOs stay relevant in an increasingly disruptive digital landscape? And more than that, how can they get even better? How can they improve their practices and increase their impact? So within this project so far, we've looked outwards and provided conservation practitioners with some basic knowledge of existing and emerging technologies. To this end, we've published a digital toolkit with an introduction to Web3 concepts. And we also provided ideas and inspiration for how new digital technologies can impact nature conservation efforts. We've presented our insights and run workshops with organizations like WWF Netherlands, WCS Indonesia, and the senior leadership of the Wildlife Trust in the UK. We've got two members of WWF Netherlands and Wildlife Trusts with us here today who will be part of the conversations later on. We've collectively explored the systemic impact of disruptive technologies on and for the conservation sector. And Uta will be talking about Web3 and inclusivity as it pertains to conservation in her presentation. And alongside this looking outwards process, we've also looked inwards. So we've turned the lens very much in on ourselves and realizing that Unearthodox and ourselves as individuals are part of the system and not apart from the system. We've asked ourselves, how can and should we remain aware of the rapid evolution of digital technologies and communities? And they are so rapidly developing, that can be really difficult sometimes. And what would it mean for the way that Unearthodox operates and relates to its stakeholders to remain aware and utilize these digital tools? So we've embarked on a challenging, yet definitely very fascinating exploration of new and emerging digital landscapes. And it's fair to say that that has been with a bit of a sense of urgency, because like it or not, digital disruption is happening all around us as we speak. We've also been fully aware of the need to maintain a critical and reflective approach. So that is something that we really want to get across during these sessions today, is that need to look at both sides and have that balanced discussion. We found the journey really full of potential for the conservation sector, and today we'd all love to share with you some of the lessons we've learned so far, and also would love to hear about your experiences and insights. So thank you again for being here. I hope you're going to enjoy this session, and I invite you to join in the conversation by writing your questions in the chat throughout. I will say at this point that I will not be part of the panel discussion at the end, because I really do want to leave the floor to our amazing researchers and practitioners to answer those nuanced questions, but I will be able to answer questions in the chat. So this brings me to the presentation component, the need for change. So I wanted to take the opportunity here to talk about my key high-level insights from the past 2 years within the Digital Disruption Initiative. It's fair to say that when I started this project, I was so new to the digital sphere. I came in with no knowledge of blockchain, no digital background. As Catherine mentioned, I was a wildlife rehab gal. I was very much on the ground work, completely new to this space. So I was slightly skeptical, and I did have these subconscious resistances of these, to me, quite nebulous concepts that were just seemed quite out there to me. So I didn't understand them at the time, but was interested and wanted to know more about them because I could see the appetite for change that was out there. So the couple of slides I have today are about that bigger picture thinking that leads me here today with a presentation entitled The Need for Change. I'm not going to dwell on this point because I'm pretty sure that we are all aware about this. But as this talk is about the need for change, I'm going to briefly mention that business as usual is neither sustainable nor desirable. This isn't to say that the conservation efforts currently going on that we're all part of are not vitally important and impactful in creating change, but they as they alone, as they currently stand, are not enough to reverse the trends that we're seeing. Additionally, we see here pictured here on the right with the 4 key themes for change, we see the need for change from an equity and justice perspective regarding the conservation sector and potentially harmful practices that could be perpetuated without mindful forward-thinking change. So speaking as a conservationist from the so-called global north, there is a need for us as a sector to look at what is our relevance and impact potentially in the future, and can we identify and harness opportunities now to maximize our impact in a way that is equitable. So the first signals that I saw that a level of systemic change was happening that I was previously unaware of was regarding the digital communities that we were exploring. It was the communities that really made me sit up and go, okay, like there may be something going on here that I didn't realize, that I was unaware of. And there's some exciting potential here that is yet to be tapped into. And on the screen, anyone that's been part of my previous presentations would have seen these stats, but they're the ones that really made me sit up and pay attention at the beginning. You can see with Twitch and Discord, and I'd be very interested to know how many of the people here today know of Twitch and Discord, but Twitch being a video streaming platform kind of akin to YouTube, and Discord being kind of a sort of like a Slack channel, a social media platform, really engaging in two-way conversations. And you can see here the 2 stats regarding these, that in 2020, the users of Twitch raised $83 million for US dollars for charity. Now, this was completely self-led charity work they were doing. They was just coming from this very innate philanthropic drive to use their community for good. And this was just one of the signs we saw within the communities, that they had this desire to use their community, use their individual platform to do good within the world. And the second platform here, Discord, it was the fastest growing website in the world in 2020. And that is no mean feat. I think we can all say that that's a pretty epic stat. And what we saw is that the Web3 projects we're investigating, we're using Discord primarily to curate and create and grow their communities around the Web3 initiatives. And these communities really wanted to be heavily involved. They seemed quite frustrated with the current state of conservation efforts, and they were eager to be part of the change. And they also had these digital skills that maybe we as a conservation sector don't currently have in-house. So being immersed within these platforms, I saw profound change in the way people were communicating, and saw how the desires and the skills of these communities could be potentially of huge benefit to the conservation sector. And the next big signals were regarding the technologies themselves. So over the past few years, we've seen disruptive digital trends influencing industries across the board. An obvious example is that of the mainstreaming of ChatGPT, and that was followed by waves after waves of organizations trying to use AI to remain relevant and also to enhance their customer experiences and bring in new forms of value creation. So this was the second major signal that, again, made me take notice and think there's more potential to digital disruption and Web3 technologies than I first realized. And this was the report, the Gemini Global State of Crypto report in 2022. And this report saw that so-called developing countries were having higher rates of cryptocurrency adoption, sometimes more female investors than male, and critically, they saw cryptocurrency as the future of money. Now, these statistics may well not be the case anymore. I will say that the area is so rapidly changing. The digital space is such a rapidly changing space. And as we've all seen, there's been hypes and crashes over the past few years. But this signal, combined with the fact that we were seeing projects in the so-called global south that were using these technologies and having a desire to use these technologies to potentially gain financial inclusivity and reduce power imbalances, was a really powerful signal for potentially systemic change occurring in this space. So Uta's shortly going to be talking about the realities that can be seen regarding Web3 and inclusivity. But this was surprising for me at the time and was the second signal that really caught my attention. At this point, I also want to say that coming from a non-digital background and being in the conservation sphere, these signals can also be incredibly confusing. We saw a frantic hype around NFTs and cryptocurrencies, and we saw then a pretty damning crash in general media ridicule. And so what I wanted to showcase here with this slide, for those that are not aware of the Gartner hype cycle, is that all innovations tend to follow a similar trend. There tends to be the trigger for the innovation, then there comes inflated expectations where people get really excited about the promise that this might hold. And then the initial teething issues come into play and we have this trough of disillusionment. And then we start to see the real utility emerging over time. And so was the hype around NFTs extreme? Absolutely. Was the crash huge? Yes. But that doesn't potentially mean that there isn't core underlying technologies there that could have profound potential use cases to create change in the conservation sphere. So what I want to get across here is that with every innovation, it can be hard, but it's important to look past that hype, look past the frenzy, be skeptical, but also be open-minded. Look at what these things might mean for the future when they come into that space of real utility. There will keep being these hypes and crashes, especially as we've seen with this Web3 space that is so rapidly developing. So where you want to position yourself regarding the identification and use of these utilities, either as, say, early adopters or as fast followers, this is completely up to you. There's no right or wrong answer there. But just be aware that this is a normal flow that happens. And this leads me on to the more practical aspects of what should we be doing, knowing that we as a sector need to find areas to potentially become more impactful, to become more equitable. And we know that the digital space is going to keep evolving. The newer generations are going to keep being more and more digitally savvy. What can we do? And firstly, I want to say again, it's okay to be skeptical. It's also important to understand what's out there. And that's this first point, remaining aware to remain agile, understanding what's going on, where the communities are, what they're talking about. We need to do this so that we can look past the hype, identify the opportunities, and really importantly, be agile enough to respond to a risk when it arises. So to help with this process, as I said, it is a pretty big minefield out there. It's a pretty complex space, especially as people that are new, such as I was, to the conservation sector. So to help, I would to the digital sector. To help, I would strongly encourage talking to people from the digital sphere. And if your conversations are anything like mine have been, like my teams have been, you would be absolutely blown away by how willing they are to freely donate their skills and knowledge to causes such as nature conservation. I think we as a sector could really learn from their open source nature as well, and how much they really do want to help support our causes. The third point here, aligning with a shared language, is particularly important if you're hoping to undertake change from within an established conservation organization. Within the looking inwards process that I mentioned earlier, it became clear very early on that before we could start looking at how we could make the most of digital disruption and digital transformation, we had to have that shared language. We had to have working definitions of what these things mean to us and the organization, and how might these things add value to us and the organization. And then lastly, I've got here looking forward. Not just looking at the present, but also anticipating how changes in the digital landscape, how the trends that we're currently spotting might affect you and the causes you are working on in the future. And again, I'm not saying this is easy. It is such a rapidly developing space, but we can support the creation of environments that can remain agile throughout the rise of new innovations, be that digital innovations or other innovations. And Gal will actually, I believe, be talking about how we can shift things at a mindset and culture level to ease that process. So that is actually all from me. That was a bit of a brain dump, and just thank you so much for being here and listening. And I will be responding to some questions in the chat if you have any. Thank you. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Sasha. And I see that we already have a comment in chat, and we'll be coming back to that, particularly around the use cases and the examples that we're going to be seeing today. I think now we'll turn directly to Gal and his presentation. Gal Zanir is a wildlife biologist and a conservation innovator who co-founded biotech startup Wild Biotech, where he led expeditions to unravel the secrets of wildlife and their microbiomes. He is currently serving as the digital innovation consultant for the Digital Disruption and Future of Conservation project at Unearthodox, and he's leading research on emerging tech and their use for nature conservation. And he's recently founded Nature Perspectives, an initiative aimed at simulating non-human perspectives using AI, which is probably quite stimulating as well. So Gal, I hand over to you to give us your words on your various pieces of work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And thank you everyone for being here. So, let's see, yeah. Drawing upon the need for change that Sasha has just shared with us, we went on to explore this intersection between digital innovation and nature conservation for the past almost 2 years now. We've met with a lot of conservation innovators, conservation entrepreneurs, and organizations who are willing to adopt digital technologies to create impact for nature. And drawing upon these interviews and these engagements, we figured out that there are some things that are shared between those innovators who innovate effectively and innovate on a larger or wider impact for nature. And I will try to share with you in the next few slides some of these observations and insights so that you can take them with you. They are insights at the mindset level. So what can we do to think a bit differently on this process of adopting emerging technologies for nature? Now, the first observation that I will share with you is that digital initiatives in conservation are mostly designed for lower systems leverage points. If you're not familiar with the 12 leverage points in a system, it's an article which I would recommend you to check out by the brilliant environmentalist and system scientist Donella Meadows, where she shares 12 different types of interventions that we can do in a system, whether it would be a social system or an economical one, and orders them by their their impact potential over the system. Now, what we've observed over our research is that most of the initiatives utilizing emerging technologies for nature fall in the lower sides of these leverage points. For instance, blockchain use cases for nature conservation are mostly concentrated around enabling access to carbon credit markets or biodiversity credits, which falls somewhere around creating negative feedback loops in our economy. Other blockchain initiatives are used to fundraise for nature conservation, which falls even lower on these leverage points, sorry. And it's not that these are not important projects. These are incredible projects who are doing a lot of impact, but we hardly see any organizations who are utilizing these AI and blockchain and metaverse and virtual world technologies at the mindset level. How can we make people think differently of nature, and how can we change our societal relational dynamics with nature? So the first insight in that regard would be that we should seek opportunities to leverage digital technologies at a deeper systemic level for nature. And we've all seen it happening with social media platforms where they've influenced vastly our societal structures over the past 2 decades. So it is possible to use technology in these ways. And we are starting to see it coming up in the conservation sector as well. These projects that you see underneath are starting to work with AI to enable us to communicate with other species and to think differently of the nature around us. So we are starting to see it happening. Observation number 2 was that small conservation organizations or projects struggle to leverage these and adopt these technologies due to lack of resources. You can imagine any project anywhere in the world, small project trying to set their infrastructure for their own cryptocurrency or NFTs, and the amount of technical expertise and knowledge that it requires, and nevertheless the financial resources to do so. Now, what we've seen in other sectors is when these challenges for small projects arise, there are actors who act as enablers. And I'll give you an example from the private sector, for instance. No one is expecting a small business to build their own infrastructure for cloud services or storage services. There are bigger actors who act to build and innovate, enabling platforms. And our insight is that we should do the same in conservation. Those who are able to adopt these technologies can become enablers and should aspire to become enablers. And we're starting to see that as well. For instance, EVR Green Studio, who are enabling smaller conservation projects to build their own virtual spaces, or Single Earth, who enables small conservation projects to access the massive carbon market. So this is our insight number 2. For another observation, we've also seen that we tend to focus on present risks of emerging technologies, and that narrow our ability to identify wider opportunities. There is a sense of dualism when it comes to technology. It's either bad, and then we dismiss it and do not have anything to do with it, or it's good and we go and we sometimes overlook the risks within it. So we've seen it happening with the case of blockchain, for instance, that most of the people in the conservation community were aware that there is a massive issue around the environmental impact of blockchain, but very little people knew to describe what useful use cases can we and how can we leverage blockchain for nature conservation. So this tendency to over-focus on risks kind of hinders our ability to identify opportunities, and hence another insight at the mindset level or a recommendation is whenever we come to learn of a new technology, we should focus on opportunities first. First, try to seek what is there to be gained out there before we delve, and it's very important to acknowledge the risks and to mitigate them along the way as well. Fourth of the observation was that digital conservation initiatives mostly address and react to the conservation challenges of the present. Now we've seen it happening everywhere, but we've seen very few projects who are trying to project 5 or 10 years ahead and influence the challenges, the conservation challenges that may arise in such futures in the future, but addressing them today. So I'll give you an example and I'll make it clearer. Insight number 4 is that we can actually plan for the future, looking for portals to influence it today. For instance, if a projected future is that within 5 to 10 years, we will have autonomous self-driving cars on a road as the main ways of transportation, what kind of conservation challenges will arise from such a future, and how can we address them today? And there is this wonderful publication that I recommend as well, looking into this projected future and saying how can we today position ourselves as conservation organizations within the places where they train the algorithms of the car, to make sure that these algorithms are trained to prevent roadkill in 5 to 10 years. Because these are considerations that are not taken into consideration right now where these decisions are made. So this is just an example of how can we influence future conservation challenges and address them. Last but not least, we've seen many people around us, including us, because we were not technological experts when we approach this challenge and project. We often find it challenging to inform ourselves about emerging technologies. That's because of the jargon, the feeling that we're not technical experts, and hence we cannot contribute to these discussions. But reality is, and what we've seen time and time again, is that some of the most creative ideas often come from non-experts, from those people who inform themselves to have a basic understanding of emerging technologies, so that they can bring their conservation expertise into the discussion table. So that's an encouraging insight for all of us out there. And the resources are there, whether it's YouTube videos to gain basic understanding of technologies, or whether it's the Digital Disruption for Conservation Toolkit on Unearthodox's website. So just to wrap it up, guys, these are the mindset level takeaways. We should seek opportunities to create deeper systemic levels. We should aspire to become enablers so that we enable others around us to enjoy these and leverage these technologies too. We should focus on opportunities first, so that our ability to identify opportunities is not hindered. And we can plan for the future and remember that creative ideas come from non-experts very often. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, and also for those great summary takeaways. I think when we're talking about the culture of innovation, it's really important to be clear about the dialogue and how we're sort of approaching technologies and innovation itself. So that's very, very useful points. I think we'll come back to further discussions and Q&As afterwards. We're also going to be putting up a survey in the chat box for people to take after. It would be great for you to take that survey, everyone who's sort of here with us today. I think now we'd like to turn to lessons learned on, on an introduction to Uta Muktamarianti. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that well enough, who's the research and event support person for the Digital Disruption and the Future of Conservation Initiative. Now, she holds degrees in forestry and conservation leadership from the University of Cambridge, along with 6 years of experience working in the area. In the sector spanning illegal wildlife trade, behavior change strategies to species conservation. So quite a diverse background. And she's also an artist, using her skills in painting, poetry, and monologues to convey conservation ideals to a broader audience. And her strong interest in the internet and participation in digital communities has led her to explore how emerging technologies are subtly reshaping the conservation landscape, particularly in terms of inclusivity. And Uta, I'd really like to hear your perspective on this and turn the mic over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Catherine. Thank you for having me, everyone. As Sasha and Catherine already mentioned previously, I will be presenting about the application of Web3 in conservation and how it is impacting inclusivity in the practices. So this presentation is actually in part of my findings from my research for my master's dissertation at the University of Cambridge, collaborating with Unearthodox, and I have been deep diving this topic since April this year. So as Catherine mentioned before, my background is non-technological whatsoever related. And I'm gonna show you, sorry, oops. I'm going to show you this picture. This is a forest fire that has been happening in my home country in Indonesia since several months now. And why I'm showing this picture is because I'm sure a lot of other biodiversity and climate crises are happening across the globe now. Hence, I think inclusivity is crucial in addressing the unprecedented crisis because it's impacting everyone quite differently in different landscapes in different regions of the world. And yet, the conservation sector sadly has long struggled to implement inclusive practices, as you maybe see in news or like in papers calling for more inclusive practices in conservation. So I mentioned earlier that my background is not from technology or whatsoever. My background was in forestry and conservation science, and I have been working with archetypal conservation NGO in Indonesia. But I'm always fascinated with the power of the internet and its vibrant digital communities, spending quite a lot of time as well in Discord servers and internet forums myself. I see how this digital world actually has massive, massive potential, but the conservation sector is yet to tap into this realm. Fortunately, I had the opportunity to embark on a journey with Unearthodox to explore the potentials of Web3 and associated emerging technologies in addressing biodiversity and climate crisis. So initially, for someone with no tech background like me, Web3 looks so promising to shift the status quo in conservation towards more inclusive practices with all the promises, decentralization, democratization. I also discovered that Web3 allows anyone, anywhere to do conservation, allowing locals to do their own natural stewardship without relying on the money trickling down from big international conservation NGO or donor institutions, which often these donor institutions give restricted funding, in contrast to Web3 based projects that I learned is more flexible with the funding they bring into conservation. And with the emergence of decentralized science, Web3 has a huge potential to level the playing field for conservation scientists, especially those in the so called global south countries. However, I also learned that there are many Web3 projects out there engaging with indigenous people, local communities, and their land. And I discovered one that violated the rights of an indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest. The project acquires land within forested areas in the Amazon, divides it into plots, and mint new digital tokens to represent the value of the associated land. Conservation actions or biodiversity and sell it in the digital world. The project, however, has the lack of free, prior, and informed consent and lack of consultation with the communities. The projects indeed keep in touch with just one of the leaders, but ignoring the hundreds of residents scattered in many communities and dozens of families in the area. And there are some other projects raising concerns around cultural appropriation. There are NFTs on sale promoting harmful stereotypes of early Maori as violent warriors and people who frequently murdered their children. Some projects are experimenting on vulnerable communities that are victims of natural disaster or political instability, for example. Although these examples are not exclusively within the conservation domain, but I learned from the report by Dr. Margie Chisman, informed from her fieldwork with refugee women who are now required to receive aid via Web3 tools, The report informed that these projects promise autonomy and empowerment, but they involve difficult reconfigurations, demands, and ruptures to people's economic lives, and they are not necessarily driven by concerns, choices, and priorities of the marginalized groups they are targeting. However, indeed, there are projects that have implemented appropriate engagement processes with local communities and stakeholders. These are some of the examples. One project, they try to engage with the knowledge exchange with the communities, stakeholder interview, in-depth research, hands-on workshop, trying to appropriately engage the communities into the project. Some others try to have WhatsApp group and then have rapid communication with the communities, doing webinars to make them understand what kind of project they are. And that is a really, really good step. There are also projects that aim to enhance diversity within their teams, putting concern and attention about the gender balance and the backgrounds, diverse backgrounds in their team, like this one. However, I have not come across a project with clearly defined objectives and structured strategies for engaging with stakeholders in indigenous people and local communities in a way that fosters inclusivity. While many projects involve indigenous people and local communities and stakeholders out there best in Web3 technologies, it's surprising that their white papers and reports often lack indicators of success related to partnering with stakeholders, for example, or how they measure their impact, how they safeguard the rights of these communities. Meanwhile, ensuring the protection of these rights is essential in preventing the perpetuation of unjust practices. So a little bit of a background about myself. I'm coming from a Betawi community. It is a continuously displaced native group of the capital city of Indonesia. So I can't help but worry that such practices of involving indigenous people and local communities and their lands without proper consultation and engagement strategies will open up a door of perpetuating injustice and green grabbing, as Web3 projects for biodiversity conservation actually have penetrated Indonesian landscapes. Hence, I think it is important for technopreneurs and conservation leaders alike to be aware of the red flag and green flag of Web3 projects in conservation. Through what I learned from my exploration, the projects would be a red flag if they're experimenting on vulnerable communities. For example, fractionalizing lands into pieces, commodifying it, but without having clear, free, prior informed consent and safeguarding strategies, for example. Or like projects seeing all the problems in conservation as applicable for techno-solutionism, because many of the problems in conservation are actually very deep-rooted in racism, for example, or socioeconomic and political instability. And the projects with green flag, I learned that if they're having clear conservation objectives, metrics, indicators, and measurements in their white paper and their report, being transparent about it, and then how do they ensure equitable access, rights, and benefits between developers, users, and any other roles in the project. And of course, not engaging or experimenting with vulnerable communities if the project doesn't have enough capacity in place, no experts, for example, or appropriate time to really understand and learn about the communities. So reflecting on this exploration, with the rapid transformation of digital technology in our daily life that reshapes industries now, including conservation practices. As a conservation practitioner myself, I think it is very essential to be well-versed in these technologies to define indigenous people and local communities' data and conservation interest. And additionally, as Web3 application is still in its infancy, I think it is very important to do empirical assessment of Web3 applications in conservation to really understand how specific projects impact biodiversity and socioeconomic change. But most importantly, I would really love to see conservation leaders, practitioners, and scientists to be anticipative leaders instead of continuously mitigating crises. So to take part in this space of Web3 and conservation is very important to ensure the more inclusive conservation practices and more equitable future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Uta. There's so many elements that I think we need to come back and discuss on this. And it speaks so much to so many of our journeys in this space and the real importance of addressing the assumptions of tech culture and innovation, knowledge and inclusivity, and the governance. So the governance elements that you spoke of, I really look forward to bringing back those elements in our discussions going forward. Right now, I think we're going to move into the next series of presentations with Alice Kershaw and Jon Dallinga. So Alice is the head of digital transformation at the Wildlife Trusts, a UK-wide grassroots network of 47 charities. She coordinates the root and branch digital transformation elements of their shared 2030 strategy, which is focusing on data skills and ensuring the trusts have a good understanding of digital and what they need. She's a specialist in change, transformation, and creating a digital culture which creates benefits for all users, and has worked for a wide variety of third sector organizations, including small and medium-sized charities, national funders, and development organizations. And I'll let her speak to that, but we note that, there's human side to our speakers. She lives near Bradford in West Yorkshire, and in her spare time goes running in boggy, lumpy places, usually with cake. So I'll turn to her, and I'll also introduce Jon at the same time, if that's all right. And Jon Dallinga has a background in tropical forestry and a master's in geoinformation science. He started his career as a research assistant at Wageningen University in research, which I know quite well. So welcome, Jon. After which he moved to the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, where he's now the Forest Foresight Program Manager. Jon's been working for WWF Netherlands for almost 7 years, and he's been working on data-driven conservation and innovation projects within WWF and leading the program Forest Foresight, where deforestation is predicted in order to tackle illegal deforestation. And within WWF, his focus is on exploring the digital disruption solutions for complex conservation challenges with technical partners. I believe, Gal, you're going to be giving a presentation, so we'll start with you about the mindset and culture of impact.
Sorry, Catherine. I think Catherine is having a bit of a mind blank there, Catherine. I think the illness is taking effect. We've had Gal's presentations already.
Oh, sorry.
This session now is the 15 minutes in conversation with Alice and Jon.
Right.
So we have, I believe.
I apologize.
That's all right, Catherine. There's a couple of questions. Do you have them in front of you?
Yeah, I do. I do apologize. I'm
Not at
feeling
all.
really, really, really rough with a very bad fever and didn't manage to brief as much as I should have. So I apologize to everyone here today. But I think let's start right into the conversation. So again, it's with Alice and Jon, not Gal. Gal will come back. And I think we need to speak with, sorry, I'm really not feeling very well. Sasha, could you take the mic for a moment?
Yes, absolutely, Catherine. I'm more than happy to take over. Let me just change the spotlights around. Brilliant. Thank you. Hi, Alice. Hi, Jon. How are you doing? I'm glad. Thank you for being here as well. And the first question we have is a bit more of a broad question, just to give anyone in the room about who doesn't know you guys a bit more information about where you're coming from here today and your background. So if we well, I'll ask both of you the same question. So the question is going to be on your journey in this space. What brings you here today? What sparked your interest in digital technologies in the first place? And what you're doing within your conservation organizations regarding digital innovation. So who shall I start with, Alice or Jon? Alice, I'm going to start with you.
Excellent. Thank you, and really great to be here. And I hope you feel better soon, Catherine. That is no fun. So hi, I'm Alice. Yeah, I'm regretting what I wrote in my my introduction to myself. But yeah, I do live near Bradford, and I work for the Wildlife Trusts. As was said, we are a grassroots organisation, and my interest in digital predates the Wildlife Trust. But one of the things I wanted to highlight is that could there be a better way to have innovation than have 46 different organizations trying to solve the same problem and deliver the same strategy, but in very different contexts across the UK and the Crown dependencies? So we work together on a kind of co-created strategy, which is our strategy to bring nature back. So it's not just about kind of like keeping what we have, it's about recovery. We are one of the most nature depleted areas of the world. But to kind of to actually answer your question, my interest in this is basically, I love solving problems. I find it really fascinating looking at these big systematic issues and seeing where can we put some leverage in. So I love that thing, the 12 points of leverage. I was like, this is great. This is what we're trying to do. We need as many tools in our toolbox as we can get hold of. And the critical thing for me is the Wildlife Trust is and has always had a legacy of being disruptive. We've lost that now, but actually it was one of the first organizations to realize that we needed to look to the future to protect land for the future. That was the point. And that was a controversial statement in 1912 when it was originally set up. And we've forgotten that. And I think there's something about always looking to the future. How do we mitigate against climate change? How do we bring communities with us? We need 1 in 4 people in the UK to take action for nature in order to make the most of delivering on our strategy and to actually help reverse the declines. We're not going to do that on our own. We're going to need everything. So that's where digital becomes really interesting. It's one of the many tools that we have to really try and address some of this. There are a lot of others, and a lot of them are offline and a lot of them are analog. Spoilers, tech won't save us, but it's something that we need to look at. So my interest has always been, it's one of many tools. People are at the heart of what we're trying to do. It's not just about slapping technology on something, which is handy, but that's where it kind of comes from in terms of my own philosophy and why I'm here, is that I want to learn from everyone else. Like, there's no point us reinventing the wheel. We are a series of small organizations working together. We are a distributed network of trust. How do we benefit from knowing all the other people in this area? I can get so much out of having these conversations and learning from people like John and yourself, which we really have done already, to kind of not reinvent, to scale, to work together and make the most of digital.
Thanks so much, Alice. There's a lot I want to pick up on there, especially regarding, I know that you in the past have talked to me about the fact that you wanted to investigate digital disruption, but actually ended up having to maybe take a little bit of a step back and look at your foundations before being able to take advantage of that disruption space. So hopefully we'll get to that in a bit. But Jorn, I would love to hear your answer to the same question. Do you want me to repeat the question, or are you good?
Oh, it should be good. It should be good. Yeah, lovely to be here. That's great to hear, Alice. I think my sort of scope on that is quite similar. Coming from WWF, so we are a network organization. So we have a lot of WWF offices across the world, all doing also their own sort of thing on digital innovation, disruption. So you can imagine also these offices working with, from stakeholders to the sense of governments, but also to the local community level, exploring and testing all kind of new technologies. So that's why I love to be here at WWF, because you have that sort of scope from the local community in the field, in somewhere in the tropics, through your WWF office, and you can explore collectively new technologies. So that excites me. I mean, I come from a geoinformation background, right? So working with geolocation and radars and satellites, it's already tech heavy. And trying to disrupt that space, I mean, that's just that's where I would like to be, and that's where I would like to be even more so in the near future with partners. So that's my short answer, and I can elaborate a lot more on that, Sasha, but perhaps I'll just put a pin in that for now.
Thank you, Jorn. And yeah, as I was saying before about how my previous conversations with Alice based around bringing digital disruption into their organizations via going back to that foundational piece with Jorn and with WWF Netherlands, it seemed like you almost took a different approach and went by trying to prototype what that might look like by creating the AI initiative, Forest Foresight, and then trying to get people on board that way and create that buy-in. And so I guess my next question is about that enabling environment. So we heard from Gal about creating that enabling environment for innovation. And how are you and your organizations getting that buy-in, getting your stakeholders involved, and especially like internally as well, because we all know that digital literacy can vary massively within organizations, within ourselves. So what methods do you use to create that active buy-in from your stakeholders when you're looking at these digital journeys? Jorn, I'll come back to you first, if that's okay.
Absolutely. So I think the best example I can give that where it works, I can also give you a few where it didn't work. But the forced foresight, indeed, where we are predicting deforestation, I mean, that came about by bringing other partners in. So we had a few consultancies that wanted to explore the use case of AI in this sense for some of these complex conservation challenges. One being the deforestation space, but others being wildlife conflict, and for example, where future dams are being located. So the idea was, how can we actually be earlier at that table, be earlier at intervention level to prevent some of these sort of disasters, right? Sort of these conservation disasters from happening. So we explored through our partners some of these cases by building prototypes, proof of concepts, etc. And the reason why that worked, I think, is because that also alleviated some of the pressure from funding or bringing partners for a management team, right? So you sort of de-risk, or because there's always a challenge for funding. So in that sense, what worked for us on bringing sort of our office on that digital journey for testing a cool technology in this sense, a novel one, is by bringing in some partners that have the backing, that can give time and give dedication to co-create this project with you, rather than you being on your own feet, investing resources that have a risk element to it, because it's going to be disruptive. You're not sure if it's going to work. And as a conservation organization, every euro you get in, you don't want to put a lot of that in sort of a risk portfolio where you have to fail and then showcase that to the outside world, right? So that's one of the journeys. And the other one, I think, is actually worth mentioning, also relevant internally, is also to bring them on an inspirational journey, how digital disruption can work. What are some exciting examples that have worked in the outside world, and also cross departments. So not only within the conservation sort of space, but also for engagement, right? For those who talk to donors and those who talk to the general public, what are some cool new tools or technologies that help them do their work better on fundraising, for example? And that's not always a field that we typically deploy solution in, from my experience, or very receptive to these solutions. And I can talk a lot more about methods. I mean, we use the 3 horizon method, but let me just put a pin on that too. Sasha, and hand back to you.
That's all right. Thank you. Before I nip to you, Alice, just on that note, Jorn, I know that you've actually as well, to get that buy-in and to get those internal discussions, you've been having some workshops with, I think you mentioned there, bringing together different people with digital interests as well, right? And trying to reduce the silos also within your organizations. And how have you found that process of doing that?
So the example indeed of getting different departments in and looking at a sort of future visioning of how digital disruption could work for them. The nice thing is that here you bring the different insights to what they think is important for a future resilient future when it comes to the digital disruption space. It doesn't come from a tech or a conservation practitioner per se angle, right? It comes from it comes from finance, it comes from business controllers, it comes from those who work differently every day and look at a future differently, but have some great examples. I can imagine, for example, the blockchain example on finances would not necessarily come up from a conservation sort of guy that works with wildlife every day, but can imagine it coming in from a finance point of view, from a finance practitioner in the conservation space. So you would need a different look on challenges from your department. And that was received as very pleasant from our colleagues. So being involved in this sort of process, what are current trends on conservation and digital disruption, to what is a future where we could be. And that future where we could be also brings a lot of sort of guiding principles to the table, right? So in how far can we experiment with these technologies that we feel comfortable with? What are some of the absolute limits that we can't go to, or that we do refrain ourselves from? Talking to some of these ethical aspects to AI, for example. But it does help to get to a sort of positioning, right, as an office, how far you want to experiment with these disruptive technologies.
Thank you, Jorn. Alice, same question to you about getting buy-in from your stakeholders, particularly internally. And as you said, you come from a federation of 46, 47, please correct me on the details there, organizations. And that's a real challenge, right? Trying to get that buy-in across that board. How do you do that?
So yeah, I should clarify this. So there are 46 wildlife trusts that cover the United Kingdom and the Crown dependencies that manage our reserves and our kind of local wildlife trusts. I work for the wildlife trusts plural, which is also known as the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts. And to kind of answer your question, my job is not to tell anyone anything. My job is to coordinate, to support, and to act on behalf of the wildlife trusts, which in a lot of ways makes my job easier because I need to do what they want, but I'm there to provide additional resource, coaching, mentoring, support to them to help them think through what digital might mean for us. So the comment about AI and ethics, I was at one of our leaders conferences last week and ran a workshop around, okay, what might AI mean for us? We actually do quite a bit with machine learning. We don't call it AI, but for example, we do things where we scan habitats with Earth observation and then we ground truth it and feed that information on whether that Earth observation was correct about a certain habitat back into it again. And that is machine learning. It is AI, but it's not what people think of when they're thinking about that. They're thinking about ChatGPT most of the time. So it's trying to kind of almost demystify some of this with our kind of leadership, with the people who are actually doing the work as well, and making them feel that it's okay to ask some of these questions and also to look at where we are already doing the work. There's a slide I use in almost all of my presentations to trust, which is a William Gibson quote, which says, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I'm looking for where are these signals of the future coming from trusts? Who's working on something really interesting? And then how do we scale that? Because we've got the ideal model to scale a good idea across the federation because we've got these links, we've got these connections. So it's working with what we already have and kind of building on that, whilst, as you highlighted before, addressing those foundational things. You know, when we started gathering information on species and habitats on our reserves, nearly, in some cases, well over 100 years ago, we did not ever think there would be a point at which we would be able to bring all that data together. And that means the models, the processes, and the standards that we collected that against is not actually that great for training AI models now, for example. So how do we kind of, you know, we can look back and go, oh, if only we'd have all used the same data model, but we didn't. So how do we now bring that together, which is a much less exciting, much less shiny thing, but it is going to be able to enable us. So working with that and the kind of finding the use cases that are really going to add value. We only have kind of, well, the other day someone said we have 6 more harvests till 2030, which is when our strategy goes to. There is a real sense of urgency now about how we address some of these declines. So we haven't got time to play around with stuff that doesn't have an impact, and that's the really critical thing for me in terms of how I get stuff to land. We need, you know, it's finding those use cases. It's either got to be addressing a massive opportunity or reducing a massive risk. That's where we're really focusing on. We haven't got the time and the money to do anything else.
That 6 more harvest piece, that hits home, doesn't it? Wow. So we've got about 4 more minutes of this conversation here before we move to the open panel Q&A. So please, anyone who's listening, please put any questions for Alice and Jorn in the chat because we can answer those in the open Q&A coming up. I would like to ask, because I think it can be difficult talking about digital opportunities, digital risks. There can be resistances, I find, sometimes within ourselves, sometimes without us realizing, within our teams, within our organizations. And I guess one of my questions would be, what are the biggest resistances and challenges that you've faced whilst trying to progress your digital journeys or digital transformation and digital disruption within your organizations, and how have you gone about addressing those? And we've probably got about 2 minutes each to answer that question, if that's okay. Jorn, I'll start with you.
Awesome. I have a couple, but I think I'll highlight 2. I think that culture shift. So the fear of failure, right? So as I mentioned before, it's hard to sell failed cases to the general public as an NGO, as a conservation NGO. So it's very tricky to get a mindset right on where do you innovate on, what do you want to disrupt, and how do you sell that to the outside world that you're in that experimenting space. And that's okay. I mean, failed projects also bring back learnings, but often these learnings are not, you know, sexy enough to sell back to these donors or to the public domain, and that's very tricky still, right? That's a massive barrier. Also, I think for the management team to opt in on being that more risky mindset and jumping in that culture shift. That's one of them. And I mean, for us, the also challenge is that we are part of that massive network of WF offices, and each office has a sort of independency and plays around with their own solutions. So there's not a sort of coherent leadership on the disruptive space. So everyone does more or less their own thing. And we rely on sort of the kindness of sharing lessons learned amongst these offices. Which I think, Alice, you also mentioned as a challenge, having all these grassroots organizations, right? So I think these are two out of a couple, I think, Sasha, but giving the 2 minutes, I'll hand over to Alice.
That's good because you covered some of the things we have too. For me, one of the biggest challenges is firstly the emotional side of it. People feel, especially, like I've said this before, but I find sometimes turning up with a job title that has both the words digital and transformation in it, people are thinking, oh, you're going to automate my job, you're going to take away the things I like, this is going to change how I do my job. That is really difficult. So I think a lot of it is kind of, I do quite a lot of offline workshops, for example, with trusts when I first meet them. I love using Lego for this, but I like kind of doing stuff with them which is not digital so that we can kind of slightly disarm. And the other one is kind of chief execs that I deal with are incredibly expert, and they are very, very used to being able to answer, like ask the right questions about anything to do with reserve management, the finances of their charity, people management. They are not used to being able to ask the right questions about digital, and that puts people on the wrong foot. So there's something for me about helping to kind of prime people with the, what questions should we be asking about this? Because that gives people the confidence to feel that like you're not going to look daft if you're asking these questions. It's actually really important that you do. So that's my top tips.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you. There's more that I want to dig into there, and I think we hopefully will have time to within the open Q&A. So I'm going to welcome back Gal and Uta. Get ready to be spotlit, guys. And anyone who has any questions for anyone here, I said I wasn't going to be here during this part, but here I am. And if you've got any questions for Gal, Uta, Alice and Jorn, please do fire them away in the chat. I'm actually going to pick up on one that's just come in from Michael Becker, saying that the fear to change part is not typical for Web3 technologies, is it? Is that meaning that, as in, it's not it comes to other things other than just Web3, like there's just a fear of change in general? I'm not sure if I'm misunderstanding Michael's point there, but yes, I would say, would we say that the fear of change is more prominent to Web3? Have we experienced that there's more of that resistance to digital than to potentially other forms of change? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that. I'm going to pick on someone. Gal, thank you.
I think that what we're seeing today in terms of digital disruption, especially with AI, is the exponential pace in which things are taking place. So in that sense, I think that we all feel this fear of change heightened around Web3 technologies specifically. Yeah, but as I think Michael shared in the chat, it's not something new. Just the intensity of it is something that we're seeing everywhere these days.
Thank you, Gal. And I think it was Jorn you were saying about the fear of failure as well. We as a sector, we're so reliant on donors and the donor model, right? That it's a scary new space for a lot of us, and that fear for failure is quite high. Uta, did you have your hand up there?
Yeah, I just want to add some things. It's not only about the fear of change, right? But also like at least like coming from my experience working in conservation NGO in Indonesia, where we rely heavily to international donors, for example, it's really hard to explore something that is really complicated for us, like in conservation, for example. Like I see Web3, it's only because Unearthodox gives me the chance to explore this thing, and then like I had my university to support me in exploring this thing as well. But like I would say that given the opportunity is not there, not having the time, not having the enough funding to explore this thing, I would say it's going to be a massive barrier for conservation organizations, especially in the so-called global south countries, to explore this kind of space. Like it's not easy. I mean, like I've been like learning about this space for 6 months now, still not understanding a lot of things, and to have to invest a lot of time, like specific person to understand about this space, it's not cheap for conservation NGO with limited funding, for example. I would say that's also one of the reasons.
Absolutely. If I could just stop that, Sasha, the competition for limited funding, right? We see that quite being the barrier as well. If you would have to make choices on spending your budget, you would like to go for the known, where you know some of the resources are going to come in, rather than spend that on some risk portfolio. Yeah, so it comes down to some of that scarcity of funding as well, in our experience at least. Back to you.
Thank you. So I think the general answer there was, yeah, it's not new. There is a general fear, but maybe slightly heightened due to that added extra value of the risk and the change that's happening, and that unknown of the Web3 in particular. So Gal, I'm going to come to you with a direct question, if that's okay. And this is building on what you said before about like, how can you think conservationists can balance the pursuit of opportunities? Because as you said, you think people should focus on the opportunity side of things, but how can they balance that whilst being aware of the risks and the unintended consequences? Because as Uta said, there can be, right? If you don't do things right, you can propagate those unintended consequences. So how can you see that balance being held?
Thank you, Sasha. I think it's very individual, and it goes back to the mindset level and being aware and reflecting on the fact that we're all biased. We have a psychological phenomena called confirmation bias. And if we hear about risks first, when it comes to new technologies, we will look for and interpret signals to reassure our basic assumptions. And the same goes to the other way around. We see founders and innovators out there who are falling in love with ideas and kind of overlook the risks. So it all goes back to this dualism and being self-aware that we are biased to either side, even myself. You can guess to which side am I biased by recommending to look at the opportunities first. So it goes back to this self-reflection and this trying to avoid this dualism. And whenever it's like a hype cycle, a personal hype cycle, it starts with you being very hyped around the AI, let's say, and then you hear about the environmental impact, and it goes down, and it's a roller coaster. But whenever you are at the middle of this graph, and whenever you feel that you are optimistic about some of the use cases, but or are aware of its limitations, this is when you know you're right. So I would recommend not taking sides to either way. Thank you.
Thank you, Gal. And I would say that, like, so Gal's talked about that need to look forward, that need to not take sides, that kind of more mental side of things. And I guess this is a question for everyone, that from your experiences, what do you think the key skills are, the key competencies that are needed for us as conservationists and the conservationists that are here in the room? What are the skills and competencies needed for us to thrive or survive in this digital age? What would you say are the key ones? Anyone who would like to go first?
I think there's something that Jorm raised around the fact of kind of failure and being able to like not worry too much about some of that failure. It's the kind of, how do we do little kind of test and learn and not put too much at stake, and then kind of build on that. So there's something around just kind of a bit of, which actually a lot of conservation already does. We do that with a lot of our kind of management of things, where we see if it worked, and then if it did, we build on that. So I wonder whether there's something there about using that skills and expertise that people already have in the conservation sector to see what's working, and you're applying that then to digital, of like, how do we test and learn with this? How do we kind of have a bit of curiosity around it? I'm not sure if I'd be saying like, you really need to learn how to code, or you need to know prompt engineering, or, I don't think it's that. I think there's something about a curiosity in it that I think is already here, because, and there's obviously an interest because there's people on this call who are interested in it. And I think maybe building on that and slightly demystifying some of it might be helpful, rather than hard skills, although I think they're absolutely valid as well.
Yeah, soft skills are just as important, right? If not more important in many, many ways. I do want to actually just quickly flag that there's a survey that's been put in the chat. Please do click on that link now and have it in your tabs open. Even if you don't fill in the survey right now, you can do it later. So thank you so much for that. Does anyone else want to answer that question following on from Alice about the key skills that are needed? Jorn?
Yeah, just to build on that comment briefly, I think, so how we're deploying that right now, and we're testing this, so don't take this as a granted or something that's working, but having an innovation pipeline or an innovation process that indeed builds on this typical way of innovating, right? So meaning you're building proof of concept, you're prototyping, but in that sense, we are using the money that we have from a NGO, from a WWF, to invest in that high risk sort of, with limited funding needed to invest in some of these pilots, in these prototypes. And once we've seen the few that work, we're going to bring those to some foundations or major donors that want to have some of that de-risking already done for them, and then invest in something that's more pilotable or scalable. So we're actually actively going to test this slightly adjusted new method. I mean, it's built on old experience in that sense. So that answers the question a bit that's put on chat from Michael. I mean, we don't have a list of donors who are very intrigued on a lot of these new and very highly experimental pilots or projects, but we have seen a few that are actually seeking out some of these more disruptive, I want to play that niche sort of donor field. So they say we only going to go for projects that have a sort of high risk but high reward or high gain sort of projects. So there are donors out there that seek for those. So that's one way of how we're doing that new innovation thinking. And I think it builds on the capabilities that Alice just mentioned, right? Is in that sense a mindset, in that sense of having a strict sort of stage gate criteria in your mind as well, right? So be aware that assumptions are checked regularly, so you don't overinvest or overspend your time. So it's in that sense, trying to find an innovation or digital disruption process that's guarded well enough across departments.
Thank you, Jorn. And I can see that people have been, I say people, as in our panel here, Alice, Gal, have been answering some of the questions in the chat as well. And as you mentioned, Jorn, there about the question from Michael about the list of donors who are open to more new experimental strategies. So there's some answers to that in the chat. I also want to use that opportunity to flag that there will be a conversation this coming Thursday, the 26th, on shaping the future of giving, and it could be interesting to bring some of these insights into that chat too about what's needed from the donor funding sector, or just the future of the philanthropic sector, to enable the conservation sector to take advantage of these potential opportunities. So we've got a question here about what about including this kind of learning when in the induction and upskilling phases of teams and individuals. I mean, from my perspective, yes, I would agree. It seems like a no-brainer, right? Does anyone have any experiences of kind of potentially bringing the skills up of your teams in this way that can help enhance that innovative mindset? I don't know if Alice or Jorn, you've got any experiences of that?
So when I first started, so I've only been at the Wildlife Trust for 2 years. One of the things that I clocked early on is that we didn't have a real understanding of some of the kind of digital ways of working, like agile kind of methodologies. So started running some quite interactive, just real basic agile for beginners courses aimed at anyone across the Federation, and managed to get, did it for about a year, managed to get about 100 people kind of in the first year, and then another kind of 50 or 60 in the second, to build a bit of a network of people who had those kind of skills and abilities. It was free training. It was quite fun. People quite enjoyed coming along, and they would have a project. So we got things like Tinder for beavers and things like that. It's important. But to kind of like a bit of a jokey project, but like something that they came up with these, by the way, not me. And then we would work through it in an agile way and practice kind of prototyping. What does it mean for something to be an alpha, beta, live, all of that. And that was like just a way to slightly, once again, demystify it, make it a bit fun, de-scarify it, and, come up with some things that maybe will develop, probably not that, but you never know.
That was excellent, Alice. Was not expecting the phrase Tinder for beavers to come up in this conversation, but I'm very glad it has. So I know that you also mentioned using Lego and things like that, right? To again, demystify, bring that digital nebula space back into that. Oh, timber for beavers. Definitely thought you said Tinder. I'm so sorry.
Oh, I did. You were right, but that's what we called it.
Okay. God, I thought that was a faux pas then. So Yeah, about demystifying those digital things and bringing them back into the physical that may help people. So yeah, I love this, and please do feel free to talk more about those. I think those training and the capacity building workshops can be super important for us to know more about. I don't know if Jorn, you have anything to add to this conversation. I can move to another question if not.
Yeah, briefly, I think within, and unfortunately, I don't think this is externally available. We have a lot of innovation resources that help any individual to go on that journey on how to innovate, right? And I mean, that comes down to culture, mindset. I mean, tackling theory of changes, sort of a 6-week kind of course, 3 hours a week, to really indulge yourself in what does innovation mean, and what am I looking at? And that can be applied to the, I mean, digital disruption era or the digital disruption space, right? In that sense, it's failing fast and learning fast, adapting fast. So that's something that we're exploring with in making these resources. But I'll have to check if these can become publicly available, because that would, of course, be a very cool thing to share. So I'll come back to that one.
That would be amazing. And that comes back to what I was saying about the digital communities and being that open source nature that we see elsewhere. Would be so great if we could have a bit more of that ourselves, right? And learn to work less in silos, which we always talk about. Uta, I have a question for you that's targeted more towards your personal experiences. So you did mention, and I love your illustrations, by the way, thank you so much for including those. You mentioned that you transitioned from being, in your words, a sparkly enthusiast when thinking about the Web3 for conservation space, and that maybe you became a little bit more disillusioned with that as time went on, and a few more concerns crept in there. So can you elaborate a little bit more about your transformation or like progress within that space? How are you feeling now about it, and potentially any key concerns that are concerning you at the moment?
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. First of all, thank you for pointing out that those are my illustrations, guys. Those are my illustrations, my doodle. So thanks. In my presentation, I mean. And yeah, I'm actually still seeing myself as someone that is hoping so much in this space of Web3, because like, I mean, especially about decentralized science, for example, like it's, if it can be realized as ideal as it sounds, like it will really address the helicopter science phenomenon, and like leveling the playground for conservation scientists and the global the so-called global south, right? We don't have to worry again about article processing charge, for example, which is very expensive, and that's really a barrier for conservation scientists. At least in Indonesia, we cannot pay for article processing charge. We cannot publish our journal that way. So decentralized science is really a good promise. So I'm still very enthusiastic about this space, but yeah, I have a lot of concerns now. Like it's becoming more apparent because like I see so many projects from coming from the so-called global north countries, for example, coming into Indonesia, trying to engage with the people. But then as simple as I see their developer team or like the core team, like they don't have anyone from Indonesia, and they don't really disclose, like they're not being transparent in their white paper or like in their report. How are they engaging the people? How are they like onboarding the knowledge of the Indonesian people or like any other people like in the world that they are doing the project in? So that's like the kind of thing that really flag in my mind, becoming a red flag in my mind. Like how are you ensuring that these people's perspectives are really represented in the project that you are doing? And also, like, how did the conversation even start? Like, did you come with your technology in the first place and then just, like Alice say, slapping it in the project without really trying to understand what they need? And that's as the fundamental drive in the project. Like, those kind of things that I really want to see more in Web3 projects. Not that I'm like this view is not to tell people that, hey, stop doing Web3 projects or whatsoever. No, but I want to see more of a strategic and structured plan in these Web3 projects in conservation, you know, to become better, to engage better, to be more appropriate in and working with partners and stakeholders in the local communities and indigenous people, for example. So yeah, I don't really know if that answered your question, Sasha. I hope that does, but yeah.
It does. It does. Thank you so much. So I actually am just seeing there's another question coming in the chat. How can generative AI enhance operations of organizations? What concerns you about broad usage of this technology in the conservation sector? So yeah, I guess based, we can kind of build a bit there on Uta's kind of process she's gone through herself of identifying how she's feeling about these technologies, her own concerns. I mean, Alice, Jorn, Gal, do you have any kind of concerns regarding what Piotr has said here about generative AI within organizations, within conservation sector? Or alternatively, if the answer is no, why not? Like, why aren't you concerned? Yeah.
So
Alice.
So just because I had to come up with some examples when I was running my workshop last week, I think there's big concerns around the kind of, well, here's the thing. I think it depends what it's trained on, is probably my actual answer, because that's quite a lot of the issue. When you're using a kind of open AI type chat GPT, there's a whole lot of stuff in there that reflects the bias of the internet, which I know it's not just the internet, but let's, for shorthand, but you know, what it's trained on is not great for giving us an unbiased, objective answer, but that is how we think it works. I think there's a lot we could do with generative AI algorithms trained on some of the data we have, with the caveat of let's check what biases are in there as well. But I think there's obviously things that we could save time on, you know, integrating our systems better, automating processes that we do all the time, cleaning some of our data and doing a first sweep. I think what I've always found is it always needs ground truthing, like all of the time. Like I ran a session where I was like just asking, you know, show us leaders what ChatGPT actually is. And I was getting it, I've got it set up so it should reference everything. It says, basically, don't lie to me, reference everything that you're saying. And I was asking it questions, it was referencing things, I was clicking on the links, and they were going to dead 404. These are not real websites. That's the big problem for me, is that we, you know, it looks really credible, but if you don't know enough or you don't interrogate it enough, there's a risk you take it at face value, with all the kind of biases and misinformation that's available in there. As conservation organizations, we have a huge amount of trust in us, and it's going to be really important that we hold on to that as we see more technology like this coming forward.
Thank you, Alice. I'm going to come to you, Gal, on that point, if that's okay, because I know that like this discussion, like you were talking then, Alice, about some transformative process, more like digital transformation there as well, about like kind of speeding up your processes, cleaning up data and whatnot. But as Gal was talking about at the leverage point, there could also be opportunities, right, for much higher systemic leverage points within the organizations. And I know, Gal, you've been looking into the space in particular regarding generative AI and AI in general. So do you want to say anything on this point?
Thank you, Sasha. First of all, as for the recent question, in terms of how can it serve us, how can generative AI serve us, and especially these chatbots like ChatGPT and others, I think, Alice, I agree with all your points, but it's also important to note that using these tools as reflection tools on our own data is very useful. So if you were mentioning that we all have biases in our already existing data, and these tools are very capable of identifying patterns. And once we feed it into generative AI tools like ChatGPT and ask it, can you reflect, can you criticize my data? Can you criticize my stand? Can you show me what my biases are? So it's a great way of reflecting on our own. But I will say, never to rely on it completely. Yeah, that's for sure. As for other avenues to use generative AIs for operations in conservation, I guess that the reason Sasha addressed me with this question is that I'm working these days to use these chatbots and generative AI chatbots to simulate perspectives of non-humans, so that we are able to engage in conversations with these simulated perspectives, whether it be trees or ecosystems and so on. So this is a whole different way that we can leverage these technologies. It's not about enhancing our productivity or our content creation. It's about, we can actually simulate and form profound connections with the non-humans around us using these simulations. So still a lot of risks and a lot of challenges that we have to mitigate on that front. But that's just an example of how can we completely differently use these tools for nature conservation.
Thank you so much, Gal. We're coming to the end of the conversation today. So I wanted to say thank you so much to all our speakers, and thank you for bearing with us through some of the little hiccups we had today. Sadly, we are all humans and we can get ill, and so Catherine, thank you, and I hope you're feeling okay. So thank you everyone here for your time. Thank you for your questions. If you'd like to get in touch with us with any questions, there's an email in the chat, and there's also 2 more sessions coming up. So in the chat, we can see here there is Shaping the Future of Giving coming up this Thursday, and we also have Implementing Diversity, Equity and Inclusivity coming up the following Tuesday, the 31st. So please do join us for those sessions. This is the second and last session of the digital week, so I just want to say thank you so much everyone for engaging in the conversations about digital and conservation. It's a hugely rapidly developing space with lots of opportunities, lots of challenges, and we really would love to continue these conversations with you afterwards. So please do email us, please do get in contact with us on LinkedIn and all our speakers on LinkedIn, and just thank you again for being here today.